Marcus Reed had curated his life like a high-end gallery. He kept count of his successes not in dollars, but in the things he had managed to tame. To Marcus, the world was a series of controlled environments, and he was the master of the thermostat. Standing at the altar of the St. Jude Cathedral, looking at the woman in the white lace dress before him, he felt that familiar itch of a problem becoming inconvenient. Seraphina Diop was a beautiful concept, a masterpiece of sovereign grace, but she was too bright, too intense, a fire that threatened to melt the wax figure Marcus had spent years perfecting. He decided, right there under the vaulted ceilings, that he couldn't live in a furnace. What Marcus Reed did not know, what he could not have known because men like Marcus only see what is directly in their spotlight, was that the man standing in the shadows of the third row was not just another guest. His name was Yoo Han-Sol. While Marcus saw a woman who was too much, Han-Sol saw a queen whose throne had been stolen by a peasant. Han-Sol owned the very ground Marcus stood on, the legal loophole Marcus was about to trip over, and every silent second of the future Marcus was currently throwing away. In approximately 3 minutes, Marcus Reed was going to learn exactly what happens when a coward leaves a masterpiece unattended. Seraphina Diop had spent 3 years building a life with Marcus Reed. She had come from a lineage of hidden fire, a family of West African educators and entrepreneurs who taught her that her intensity was her inheritance. But in the polished, sterile world of Marcus's social circle, that fire had been treated like a hazard. She had learned to carry her strength like a concealed weapon, always present, never shown unless necessary. She had been careful. She had dimmed her light to fit into his curated gallery because she believed that was what love required. She knew which of Marcus's friends to smile at and which ones to ignore. She knew that the surgical strategist lawyer Park Min-jae, who sat in the front row, was more than just a family friend. He was the architect of the very trap she was standing in. She had seen the look in Marcus's eyes before. It was the look of a man who realized he had bought a tiger when he only wanted a house cat. She had kept her head down, kept moving toward the I do, until the moment the air in the cathedral turned frigid. Marcus hadn't just stopped the ceremony, he had tried to extinguish her in front of everyone she knew. He didn't realize that by blowing out the candle, he was simply making it easier for the predator in the dark to see his way to the altar. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral remained shut, sealing the 3 of them in a vacuum of electric silence. Marcus stood a few feet away, his chest heaving, his face a ghostly mask of disbelief. He looked like a man who had dropped a match and now was staring in horror as the entire forest went up in flames. "Han-Sol, stop this," Marcus stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "This is a private matter. You can't just... You don't even know her." Yoo Han-Sol didn't spare him a glance. His focus remained entirely on Sera, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive surgical precision. "I know she is currently standing in the wreckage of a promise you weren't man enough to keep," Han-Sol murmured, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to hum against her skin. From the front row, a man stepped forward with the silent efficiency of a shadow. This was Park Min-jae. He didn't look like a wedding guest, he looked like a strategist preparing for a takeover. He carried a slim, leather-bound folio, opening it to reveal a set of documents that already bore the official seal of the city. "The marriage license, boss," he said, his tone as cold and professional as the steel of a blade. "Prepared and notarized. It only requires the bride's signature to finalize immediately." Marcus's eyes nearly bulged from their sockets. "Immediately? How long have you been planning this? Sera, don't listen to him. He's a monster. You know who he is." Sera looked at Marcus, really looked at him. She saw the sweat on his upper lip, the way his hands shook, and the utter lack of the protection he had promised her for 3 years. Then she looked up into Han-Sol's dark, steady eyes. There was a dangerous promise there, a surgical coldness that didn't seek to dim her fire, but to give it a hearth. "You called me a furnace, Marcus," Sera said, her voice finding her sovereign edge. Her hand stopped trembling. "But you?
She looked at Han-Sol, whose grip on her chin tightened just a fraction, an assertion of dominance she found herself craving. "You seem like a man who knows how to handle the flame." Min-jae held out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. The weight of it felt like a scepter. "Sera, no!" Marcus lunged forward, but a single sharp look from Han-Sol's enforcer in the background froze him in his tracks. With a deliberate, flowing motion, Sera pressed the nib to the paper. She didn't just sign a name, she signed away the woman who had been too much for Marcus Reed. As the ink dried, Han-Sol leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Good girl," he whispered, the words sending a shiver of terrifying heat down her spine. Han-Sol turned, draped a heavy, tailored suit jacket over her bare shoulders, and led her down the aisle. Behind them, Marcus collapsed into a pew, his world reduced to the sight of his bride walking away with a king. He was no longer the protagonist of this story. He was merely a footnote in the rise of a sovereign. The transition from the hallowed, oxygen-starved air of the cathedral to the interior of the Black Maybach was seamless and silent. Sera sat enveloped in the scent of expensive leather and Han-Sol's crisp sandalwood cologne. Outside the tinted glass, the world she had known, the world of Marcus Reed and his polite, shrinking expectations, blurred into a streak of gray. Han-Sol didn't speak. He simply sat with his legs crossed, a tablet in one hand and the other resting casually on the seat, his knuckles occasionally brushing against Sera's silk gown.
The car slowed as it approached a set of towering wrought iron gates nestled in the lush, secluded outskirts of the city. As the gates parted, the estate revealed itself, not as a home, but as a fortress of glass and charcoal stone. It was a masterpiece of surgical coldness, perched on a cliffside like a predator watching the valley below. Waiting at the grand entrance was a man who seemed carved from the same dark stone as the architecture. Choi Sang-auk stood with his feet planted shoulder-width apart, his hands clasped behind his back. His suit was tailored to accommodate the sheer breadth of his shoulders, and his face was a void of expression, his eyes scanning the perimeter with mechanical efficiency. "The perimeter is secure, boss," Sang-auk reported as the door opened. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that felt like a physical weight. He turned his gaze towards Sera, and for a moment she felt like she was being analyzed by a weapons system. There was no pity in his eyes for the tear-stained bride, only a cold, silent assessment of her worth. Han-Sol stepped out and reached back, offering Sera his hand. "This is Sang-auk. He is the shadow that ensures the light never touches what is mine." As Sera stepped onto the heated marble of the driveway, her train dragging over the pristine surface, she looked up at the sheer scale of the estate. Security personnel in earpieces moved with military precision through the gardens. High-resolution cameras tracked her every movement. This wasn't just wealth, it was an empire. Marcus had wanted a wife to decorate his life. Han-Sol had brought her to a war room. She felt the hidden fire in her chest flicker, not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp realization. The contract she had signed wasn't a refuge, it was an induction. She followed Han-Sol into the foyer, where the ceiling soared 3 stories high, draped in a chandelier that looked like falling shards of ice. "You look overwhelmed, Seraphina," Han-Sol said, as stopping at the base of a floating staircase. He turned to face her, his sharp jawline silhouetted against the moonlight. "Marcus feared your fire because he knew it would burn his paper world to the ground. Here, the world is made of stone and steel. Burn as bright as you like. You'll find it's the only way to survive in the den." The master suite was a cavern of moonlight and shifting shadows, smelling of rain and expensive scotch. Han-Sol had disappeared into an adjoining room, leaving Sera to stand in the center of the vast space. The weight of the wedding dress felt like a costume from a play that had been violently canceled, a relic of a life she no longer possessed. With trembling fingers, she reached for the hidden zipper along her spine, but the silk was stubborn, catching on the delicate lace as if trying to hold her prisoner to her past. "Allow me."
His voice was a low, melodic vibration just behind her. Sera hadn't heard him move, yet the air in the room seemed to displace toward her as he approached. She froze as she felt the heat of his body radiating against her back, a stark contrast to the chilled marble beneath her feet. Han-Sol's hands, steady and impossibly cool, replaced hers. He didn't rush. The slide of the zipper was a slow, rhythmic rasp in the quiet room. As the fabric loosened, his fingers grazed the bare skin of her shoulder, leaving a trail of electric shivers in their wake. He didn't pull away once the dress was undone. Instead, he stepped around her, his gaze sweeping over her with a clinical intensity that made her pulse drum against her ribs. He picked up a crystal tumbler from the sideboard, the ice clinking softly, a sharp, lonely sound that echoed the surgical coldness he projected. "You're wondering why," he said, taking a slow, calculated sip. "Why a man like me would walk into a cathedral and tether his life to a woman who was a stranger 5 minutes prior." Sera clutched the ivory bodice of her dress to her chest, her chin lifted as her hidden fire began to spark. "Marcus said I was too much. He said I was a furnace. Most men in your position want a wife who is a quiet reflection, a mirror for their own ego, not a heat source that threatens to melt the decor." Han-Sol set the glass down and stepped back into her personal space. His presence acted as a vacuum, drawing the very breath from her lungs. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her collarbone before settling at the hollow of her throat. He could clearly feel her heart leaping like a trapped bird against his palm. "Marcus Reed is a man who builds his world out of cardboard and fragile pretenses. Of course he was afraid of you," Han-Sol murmured, his eyes darkening to the color of obsidian. "I don't operate in the light, Seraphina. My world is of shadows, frozen by necessity. To survive the things I have done, I have to be cold. Precision, logic, and a heart like ice. That is how I keep my empire from crumbling." He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear, a predatory intimacy that made her knees weak. "But even a man made of ice needs a reason to keep the world from freezing over entirely. I didn't choose you despite your fire. I chose you because of it. I don't want a reflection, Sera. I want a sun. I want the one thing powerful enough to melt the cold when I've been in it too long." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye, his thumb brushing her lower lip with a firm, dominant pressure. "He wanted to extinguish you because he made you feel small. I want to see how bright you can burn when you're not afraid of the man standing next to you. I'll finish what he was afraid to start, Sera, starting with the woman he was too weak to keep." The air between them thickened with a new kind of tension, one that wasn't born of grief or humiliation, but of a seductive, dangerous recognition. Sera realized then that she hadn't been rescued to be kept safe. She had been claimed by the only thing more powerful than the flame she carried within.
The sun had not yet risen when Han-Sol led Sera to the garage, where a fleet of armored SUVs stood like obsidian monoliths against the morning mist. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked less like fabric and more like armor, his surgical coldness sharpened by the early light. There was no room for the soft, lingering heat of the previous night. Today, the silk was gone, replaced by a structured black dress Han-Sol had chosen for her, a garment of sharp lines and heavy fabric that projected power as much as it did elegance. They arrived at a nondescript warehouse by the docks, the air thick with the scent of salt, industrial oil, and impending consequence. Inside, the surgical strategist Park Min-jae and the stone-faced Choi Sang-uk were already waiting. In the center of the cavernous room, a man sat bound to a heavy wooden chair, his face bruised and his eyes wide with a frantic, animal terror. "This is a supplier who thought he could sell our roots to Victor Draken," Han-Sol said, his voice as flat and final as a dial tone. He didn't look at the man, he looked only at Sera. "He has a wife, 2 daughters. He used that to beg for mercy from Sang-uk. He thinks his domesticity is a shield against the reality of his treason." Sera felt the hidden fire in her chest tighten. The warehouse felt small, the silence heavy with the man's ragged, desperate breathing. In my world, Seraphina, mercy is an investment, Han-Sol continued, stepping closer to her, his presence a dark pillar of gravity that centered the room. If I kill him, I send a message of fear. If I let him live, I risk a message of weakness. Marcus would have hesitated, paralyzed by what people would think of his reputation. But you see the truth of things. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, not a weapon, but the evidence of the man's debt and the precise location of his family. He pressed it into her hand, the weight of it feeling like a scepter. The decision is yours, Han-Sol murmured, his hand lingering over hers, forcing her to feel the physical weight of another person's fate. Do we seize everything he has and leave him to the abyss, or do we bring his family into our protection, effectively making them hostages to his future loyalty? One path is a clean break, the other is a permanent shackle. Decide what kind of queen you are. Sera looked at the man. He was a coward, much like Marcus, trading loyalty for a momentary gain. She realized then that killing him was too simple. It was an exit, a release. She wanted him to feel the weight of his betrayal every time he looked at those he loved. "Bring them in," Sera said, her voice finding a sovereign chill that surprised even the seasoned men in the room. "Give them a home on the estate grounds. Let him work the docks every day knowing that his family's comfort is the only thing standing between him and the rising tide. He doesn't need mercy, Han-Sol. He needs a reason to be afraid of the light." A slow, predatory smile ghosted across Han-Sol's lips. He leaned in, his gaze burning with a dark, terrifying approval. "Surgical," he whispered. "You've learned the first lesson, Sera. Power isn't in the strike, it's in the leash." The following Thursday, the oppressive tension of the club was replaced by the low, melodic vibration of Nala's sun-drenched apartment. Nala Sakoto sat across from Sera, pouring hibiscus tea with a grace that felt like a healing balm against the jagged edges of the previous night. Here, away from the glass fortresses and the silent, watchful eyes of Han-Sol's enforcers, Sera could finally feel the true weight of the gold band on her finger. "You've changed, Sera," Nala said, her voice carrying a rhythmic truth that bypassed Sera's carefully constructed defenses. "There's a sharpness in your eyes I haven't seen before. It's like you've stopped trying to be a soft place for people to land and started becoming the ground they walk on." Sera stared into her cup, the crimson liquid reflecting her own reflection, transformed yet unfamiliar. "I'm married to a man who uses silence as a weapon, Nala. He's cold, he's dangerous, and yet I don't feel like I'm disappearing into his shadow. With Marcus, I felt like a fire being choked by a blanket. With Han-Sol, I feel like I'm being forged." Nala leaned forward, her amber bracelets clinking softly like a gentle warning. Most women think protection is a shield. They think a man's job is to stand in front of them so they never have to see the sun. But a shield only keeps you in the shade, sister. Marcus wanted to be your shield because he was terrified of your light. He wanted to keep you tucked away where you couldn't burn him. Sera looked up, the hidden fire flickering behind her pupils with a new intensity. "And Han-Sol?" "Han-Sol isn't a shield," Nala smiled, an ancient, knowing expression crossing her face. "He is the whetstone. He isn't suppressing your heat. He's giving it a focus. He's taking all that raw, chaotic energy that Marcus called too much, and he's teaching you how to aim it. He isn't taming the lioness. He's showing her exactly where the jugular is." The realization hit Sera with the force of a physical blow. She thought back to the warehouse, to the ledger she had held and the way Han-Sol had watched her make the decision to leash the traitor. He hadn't told her what to do. He had merely provided the tools for her to manifest her own power. "I was so afraid that I was becoming a monster like him," she whispered.
"You aren't becoming him," Nala corrected softly.
You're becoming the woman you were always meant to be before the world told you to be small. He isn't the one changing you, Sera. He's just the only man brave enough to give you a world big enough to fit in." As Sera left the apartment and stepped into the waiting car where Choi Sang-wook held the door with a silent, respectful nod, she didn't feel like a victim of circumstance anymore. The surgical coldness of the estate no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a stage. She wasn't just Han-Sol's wife. She was his weapon, finally being unsheathed. The rain fell in gray, relentless sheets, blurring the sharp edges of the city as Marcus Reed stood at the perimeter of the estate. He wasn't invited, and he was certainly no longer composed. By the time Han-Sol allowed him into the foyer, a move of pure, sadistic curiosity, Marcus looked like a man who had been dismantled by the very world he once tried to curate. His hair was matted, his expensive wool coat soaked through, and his eyes were rimmed with the red exhaustion of a week-long spiral. When Sera descended the floating staircase, she didn't rush. She moved with a slow, predatory grace, her silk robe trailing behind her like a shadow. "Sera," Marcus croaked, stepping forward before Choi Sang-wook's silent, massive form blocked his path like a wall of living stone. "I've come to take you home. I know you're being held here. I know what he's doing to you, the mind games, the threats. He's a criminal, Sera. He's using your trauma to build a cage." Sera stopped 3 steps from the bottom, looking down at him. The hidden fire wasn't a flicker anymore. It was a steady, localized heat. She looked at the man she had almost married and felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. "You look terrible, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying that new, surgical chill. "You can barely hold yourself together." "I'm doing this for you," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking as he pulled a crumpled stack of papers from his pocket, annulment forms. "Sign these. We can go to the police. I have connections. I can protect you from him." Han-Sol appeared in the shadows of the upper gallery, his presence a dark weight that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He didn't say a word. He simply watched as his wife handled the ghost of her past. Sera stepped off the final stair and walked directly up to Marcus, ignoring the frantic warning in his eyes. She took the papers from his shaking hands. For a second, Marcus's face lit up with a desperate, pathetic hope. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, Sera tore the documents in half, then into quarters, letting the white scraps fall onto the wet marble floor like discarded petals. "You talk about protection, Marcus, but you couldn't even protect my dignity at an altar. You think I'm in a cage? I've never been more free. Han-Sol didn't kidnap me from you. He rescued me from a life of being small." She reached out and adjusted his crooked tie, her touch cold and final. "Go home, Marcus, before you realize that I'm not the one who needs saving. If you ever come to these gates again, I won't be the one to stop Sang-wook from finishing what you started." As Marcus was led out into the rain, trembling and broken, Sera didn't look back. She looked up at Han-Sol, and for the first time, the surgical coldness in his eyes met a matching sovereign fire in hers. The rescue was over. The rain had begun. The sirens of the city were distant, muffled by the reinforced glass of the high-rise executive suite where Victor Draken waited. He wasn't alone this time. He sat surrounded by his own logic of the abyss, a cold, sterile array of monitors displaying Han-Sol's intercepted shipping manifests. The atmosphere was frigid, the air tasting of ozone and impending ruin. Han-Sol stood to the side, his jaw set in a line of surgical tension, his hand resting near the hilt of the blade hidden beneath his cuff. He was prepared for a massacre, but Sera stepped forward before he could move. "You've been busy, Victor," Sera said, her voice a low, melodic vibration that cut through the hum of the servers. She didn't look like the woman who had wept at an altar. She looked like the woman who knew that power is a leash. Draken didn't look up from his screen.
I'm a mathematician of human failure, Seraphina. I've found the variable that breaks Han-Sol's supply chain. It's not a port or a person, it's a sentiment. He's diverted resources to protect the family of a traitor, all because you asked him to. He finally looked at her, his eyes like empty wells. That sentiment is the crack. I'm going to widen it until his empire falls into the sea. Sera didn't flinch. She walked to the center of the room, her silhouette sharp against the glowing monitors. You think my mercy is a leak, Victor. You think because I chose to collar a dog instead of killing it, I've made us vulnerable. You forgot to check the other side of the ledger. She tapped a command on the keyboard, her fingers moving with precision Han-Sol had taught her. The screens flickered. The manifests didn't vanish, they transformed. The data Draken thought he had stolen was a mirrored trap, a digital lure that had led his own capital into a dead-end shell company managed by Park Min-jae. "The family I protected," she whispered, her voice dropping to a sovereign chill. "Their gratitude bought us the encryption keys to your private servers. While you were busy calculating our sentiment, I was busy calculating your overhead. You haven't intercepted our routes, you've just funded our expansion." Draken's face, for the first time, lost his composure. The logic of the abyss had failed because he hadn't accounted for a woman who knew how to turn her vulnerability into a weapon. "Han-Sol would have killed you," Sera said, glancing back at her husband, whose dark eyes were filled with a predatory light. "But I think it's much more poetic to let you watch as the furnace you tried to extinguish burns down everything you own." She turned on her heel, the silk of her dress snapping like a whip. She didn't need Han-Sol to protect her interests anymore. She was the interest. As they walked out, leaving Draken in the silence of his own making, the abyss finally blinked. The return to the estate was not marked by the cold efficiency of the previous days, but by a heavy, expectant silence that made the very air in the Maybach feel combustible. Han-Sol did not look at his tablet, he did not check his manifests. His gaze was fixed on Sera, a dark, predatory pride simmering behind his surgical coldness. When they stepped into the foyer, he did not wait for the staff to retreat. He simply signaled to Choi Sang-uk with a sharp inclination of his head, and the massive doors were sealed, locking the world of ghosts and rivals outside. They moved toward the master suite, the hidden fire in Sera's chest now a roaring blaze that made her skin feel too tight for her body. When the doors closed behind them, the transformation was complete. The black, structured dress, her armor for the war they had just won, felt like a burden she was ready to shed. "You finished it," Han-Sol murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated in the marrow of her bones. He stepped into her space, his hands coming up to cradle her face. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, no longer clinical, but searingly possessive. "You didn't just survive the abyss, Seraphina. You conquered it." Sera leaned into his touch, her eyes locking onto his obsidian gaze. "I told you, Han-Sol, I'm not afraid of the heat anymore. I'm the one who controls it." He didn't respond with words. He leaned down, his lips claiming hers in a kiss that was a collision of silk and steel. It was the finish he had promised at the altar, the true completion of the vows that Marcus was too cowardly to even imagine. As he lifted her, her silk robe falling to the marble floor like a discarded banner, the power dynamic shifted into something primal and absolute. In the moonlight of the suite, there was no more Mafia Boss and no more discarded bride. There were only two sovereigns who had found their match in the dark. Every touch was an assertion of territory, every breath a shared secret of the empire they were building. Han-Sol's surgical coldness finally succumbed to her fire, melting into an intensity that was both worship and dominion. As the night deepened, the consummation of their union became the final seal on their contract. Sera realized that the life she had once mourned was a pale, flickering candle compared to the sun she had become. She wasn't just his wife, and she wasn't just his weapon. She was the sovereign queen, standing at the side of the only man brave enough to watch her burn. The ceremony that started in humiliation had ended in a private, absolute coronation. Together, they weren't just a marriage, they were a storm, and the world was finally theirs to command. This is where tonight's story ends, but the secrets never do.